John's account of the woman caught in adultery is exclusive, meaning we won't find it in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It has long beguiled the scholars, who are most interested in that little detail that happened in the middle of the story. After the Pharisees make their accusation, Jesus traces something in the dirt with his finger. The evangelist goes to the trouble of telling you that he wrote something in the sand. Everyone wants to know, what was it that Jesus wrote in the sand? A very fair question. And the answer may surprise you. The answer is, we have no idea what Jesus wrote in the sand. It's interesting that you have that detail, though, when we have a very clear setup. And once again, Jesus is never surprised when the Pharisees try to trick him. Remember, he is the Son of God. Therefore, he is in complete control at every moment, even of his human life. He is very aware of the situation that's come before him. Because he is God, he already knows the woman has been caught in the act of adultery. He happens to know the man who was involved as well, who is strangely missing from this particular account. Or maybe not. If you know about the injustice that's been perpetrated against women, particularly in sexual matters, since the beginning of time. Nevertheless, Jesus, aware of all of these things and aware of the Pharisees trying to catch him, they say that she should be stoned to death, and they wonder what Jesus will say. Will he contradict the law of Moses? Jesus' elliptic writing in the sand beguiles us. We have no idea what he wrote. But then when he looks, though, in the eyes of the accusers, and he says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," that's all we need to know. One by one, beginning with the elders, each person leaves, and ultimately the woman is left with Jesus alone. I'm struck by the parallel of the woman at the well, which we read in the third Sunday of Lent every year. But Jesus, once again, all alone with the woman caught in the act of adultery. The account is obvious to me when it happens there, also in John's Gospel. And the woman is at the well by herself because she's been condemned. She's been ostracized. She's not been stoned to death, but she's been condemned. She has the stoning of isolation, which many of you now know is a very difficult penalty indeed. But when she encounters Jesus, he neither condemns nor punishes her, but instead offers her living water. In this instance, when the woman is with Jesus alone in the act of adultery, he tells her, "I do not condemn you." And then he tells her to go away and do not sin anymore. Surely by now Catholics will understand the parallel of this to the sacrament of reconciliation. How often we go in trepidation, fearful of the judgment that will surely come our way, fearful of the punishment that we've been resisting for some period of time, and weighted by our conscience that brings us in. I'm struck by the way the evangelist phrases the story. The woman was caught in the act of adultery. Exactly who saw what? Who did the catching? Perhaps this is a different metaphor. It's a metaphor for what our conscience tells us when we realize we've sinned. Once we know we've been transgressed, we've once again been deceived, we've been tricked by the evil one, and that with our own free will, knowing that we should not, we entered into sin, and now we reject the consequences, and more importantly, we fear the punishment. And in the sacrament of reconciliation, there is no punishment. As a child, we used to think the penance was punishment. The idea that you'd have to say 5 Hail Marys or 5 Our Fathers. The concept that we would punish with prayer is odd to me to begin with, and it turns out to be theologically unsound. Penance actually means good works, meaning we do a good work as an act of gratitude to God who forgives, but does not punish us. The evangelist is intentional about his choice of sin, adultery. It catches our attention, doesn't it? But note Jesus' attention. He doesn't minimize adultery. Adultery is a serious sin. Consequences happen when adultery takes place. All kinds of consequences. But guess what? The same kinds of consequences happen when we gossip, when we're judgmental, when we say harsh words, when we're satirical, when we commit other acts of violence. All the different sins that we do. It just seems so popular in the modern parlance to take those sexual sins and make them in their own special category. There's a commandment about it, thou shalt not commit adultery. And you don't get stoned for gossip, although perhaps you should. But nevertheless, we tend to always think of it this way. Jesus is not saying all sins are equal. He's careful with this. He says, instead, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And that lets you and I know that when we judge others for their weakness or for their sinfulness, when we withhold our forgiveness from them, when we shun them, when we ostracize them, when we separate ourselves from them, we sin. And someone could have the opportunity to cast the first stone against us. Jesus is not making all sin equal, but he's making equal God's response to all sin. God does not condemn. God offers salvation. Lent teaches us this, that what Jesus does at the cross of Calvary is pay the full price for the adulterous woman, the adulterous man, and the gossiping man, the gossiping woman, and every other sin that happens in between. The full price is paid by our Lord, and we reap the benefits. That's the grace. You know, a few weeks ago, before we were all confined to our houses in our Wednesday night adult faith formation group, we spent an entire evening on this subject about punishment and purgation for sin, an honest discussion about purgatory. A little too heavy for this moment, but I think it's at least to suggest the fruit of what we discussed that evening, that what God wishes to do when sin becomes obvious to us is he wishes to heal us of that sin. Being caught in the act of sin rather than the act of adultery is actually a grace, because now intervention can take place. And God's intervention isn't punishment. There's been punishment enough. His intervention is mercy. And the lesson we are to learn, he says, go and sin no more, is that you and I must spend our effort being merciful. Let's be honest. Most of us do not spend every waking moment of our life being merciful. I spend way too many waking moments of my own life being merciless. And unfortunately, all of us suffer from the same thing. We have a lot of work to do, but we have a loving and forgiving God who's ready to meet us more than halfway. He's ready to meet us all the way from the cross of Calvary. And knowing this, the best act of gratitude that we can do for this God who loves and forgives us at a moment, notice if we just simply ask him, is to always remember that when someone sins against us, be not the one who picks up the first stone.